Transgenderism, what is it? How does it affect people who go through with the full radical reassignment of their gender? How many genders are there? Are you even allowed to talk about this? Welcome to the first of a series of episodes on transgenderism, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of my guests. One is Hudson Biblo, a Canadian Catholic evangelist and speaker who went through years of gender dysphoria and confusion and cross-dressing and same-sex activity. And also Dr. Michelle Cretella will join us. She is the president of the American College of Pediatricians and has done a lot of work on the front lines with children. Now this transgender mania is moving into younger and younger patients, and there's a tremendous amount of confusion out there about the whole issue. So we're going to talk about that with Hudson Biblo and Dr. Michelle Cretella. But first, join us with Walt Heyer of sexchangeregret.com and Walt Heyer Ministries. Great story. Looking forward to connecting with Walter and introducing his thought and his life mission with you right here on the Patrick Coffin Show. Straight ahead, transgenderism. Don't go away. Welcome to the show. I'm Patrick Coffin. Walt Heyer is the author of Paper Genders, Gender, Lies, and Suicide, and A Transgender's Faith. For 7 years, Walt followed his deep conviction that he was supposed to be a female and lived under the identity and name of Laura Jensen with the full sex change surgery and all that entails. As you'll hear, things as Laura did not work out as planned, and Walt was plunged into the deepest darkness of his life. Now, over 15 years after retransitioning to the sex of his birth, Walt speaks with great authority and personal experience about his life as Laura Jensen, and as a warning to those who are tempted by the lure of transgenderism. Walt Heyer, such a great honor to be with you again. Hello.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Since we last spoke on a different show that shall remain nameless, although it was Catholic Answers Focus, you had begun to write as a blogger and you started speaking. I see that has just kind of exploded. How do average audiences react when you tell your story? And we'll get into that story, but how have you gone over, as it were, as a speaker and as a communicator about this?
Well, it depends on the audience. The LGBT audience doesn't like me. The people who have the ability to exercise a little bit of gray matter and think about this a little more deeply and intellectually love what I have to say. So, it's a complicated issue that requires some deep thought, and people are being really harmed by the idea that they can change genders when they really can't. They can make themselves look different, but it's really a cosmetic appearance.
How many genders are there, Walt?
2.
Can you change your gender?
No. You can change your gender appearance, and you can change the way you sort of flaunt whatever it is. You can act feminine or masculine. The fact of the matter is nothing changes the biological components of who you are.
When did this confusion about who you were begin? When we last spoke, you mentioned your grandmother putting you in a purple dress, and suddenly the wave after wave of affirmation as a kind of feminine version of you began to take root as a child. Did that come full flower right off the bat, or is that something that went subsurface and then kind of came to full bloom later, so to speak?
Well, I think I'm very much like all kids. Young people, I was 4 years old, and I think a young person at the age of 4 has got curiosity about gender. They see mom and dad, and they see the differences, and it's very legitimate for young children to have curiosity and try to understand the differences. I think where the problem comes in is that when I began to, talk to my grandma about, maybe I would enjoy being a girl or whatever, and she affirmed me. This is the great word where we begin to damage children, and when we begin to affirm them and tell them, oh yeah, you can do this and you can wear a dress, grandma made the dress. So it is the curiosity that starts in a young 4-year-old is very normal. What isn't normal is for an adult to affirm someone into the thinking that they can actually change gender. So there's where the damage begins, and it started at the age of 4 in my life.
Where was your father in all this, Walt? What role or lack thereof did he play?
Well, Grandma said this is our little secret. So she did it at her house when she was babysitting me. And so it became our little game that we played when she was babysitting me. So Dad didn't know, Mom didn't know, my brother didn't know, my grandpa didn't know. He was a tow truck driver, and she would do it when he was gone. So this was very contained. It was very, quiet.
Did that secret ever get out in the schoolyard, say?
No, it didn't get out in the schoolyard. It did get out about 2.5 years later when I started enjoying and being affirmed so much by Grandma that I took the purple dress home. And Dad found the dress. Mom actually found the dress and told Dad. And then, of course, there was a big explosion in our household as to where the dress come from, who made it, why are you doing this? And all of a sudden, then you've got this tremendous family dynamic, which then I felt responsible for the explosion because then I had exposed the secret I was supposed to keep. So, sort of to blame for that. I was beginning to feel it was all my fault, and that further caused depression and anxiety about who I was and my gender. So you see these things beginning to pile on.
And then there's this great shame layer too, that you were victimized once by being manipulated by your grandmother as a young boy, and now all the wheels have fallen off the family. Did that come with this sense of shame and self-rejection?
Well, I wished I was at the age of 6 years old, knew that I was being victimized.
Sure.
That would have actually been helpful. I don't think you realize you don't have a grasp of anything. There's things coming at you so fast. As a youngster, and you begin to get unstable in your gender identity. So it's very complicated. I mean, a young child's taking in a lot of information, and all of a sudden you have many things, many of them you can't begin to understand, especially the big key word as I look back on it is you don't understand the consequences of what's going on. The long range, here I am 77 years old, so it's been going on in my life. I'm still talking about it 73 years later because Grandma affirmed me and made me a purple dress. I mean, that's pretty abhorrent.
At what point did you mentally cross the Rubicon? Look, I don't feel male at all. I need to transition into a female identity and get to that wellspring of affirmation. How old were you?
Well, I think I was probably 38 by then. I'd been going through this. There are many times during that my life when I felt that I wasn't. There's the conflict goes on, and I call it's like a radio playing in your head all day. And so you're battling the feelings, you're struggling with the issues, and you finally, at some point in time, you sort of succumb to the barrage of information that you've been ingesting and that's been haunting you all this time, and you're trying to figure out, how do I make this go away? And so I went to one of those great gender therapists, those people who are the specialist in all this transgender stuff. They're the most dangerous people in the world. And I went to the one who actually wrote the standards, the original Harry Benjamin International Standards of Care. I was affluent and was able to go to a real specialist. Big mistake. He said, oh, well, you have gender identity disorder. He said they're going to be changing the term to gender dysphoria. He knew in advance that we're going to be doing that. And he said, you need to take hormone therapy and undergo gender reassignment surgery, and then all these conflicts that you've got in your life will go away. Well, after all these years, you want the conflict to go away. There's no getting around that. So I listened to this great expert, had PhD behind his name, must be brilliant. I didn't have PhD, so he must have been smarter than me. I went for it, did the hormones, ended up getting divorced after being married for 16 years, 17 years, and undergoing gender reassignment surgery in 1983 by the great and wonderful Dr. Stanley Biber, who had performed, 4,500 of them.
Wow. Now, in your case, was there homosexuality comorbid here? No. Okay, well, you've written about the LGTB part, I keep the alphabet. Forgive me.
Yeah, the alphabet.
The alphabet soup keeps changing its designations and even the number of letters. Why is T attached to the LB part?
Well, that's interesting. I wrote an article actually in the Federalist. It said remove the T from LGBT, and it went skyrocketed. I mean, it was one of the most widely read articles at the time. It shouldn't be, but part of it is political motivation. This is the way they get funding. You know, George Soros is a great funder of this, and other people who want to support this. So if you bring in a whole bunch of other issues, you get more funding. So they've sometimes reluctantly embraced them. It's funny that many of the gals who are radical lesbians don't like transgenders at all. I kind of get a kick out of them. They probably speak more eloquently about the nonsense of transgenders than anybody, to be honest with you.
Yeah, they don't want to. They don't want their brand tainted by confusion, because they don't want to identify with that and all the trauma and all the.
Well,
it's like a separate category.
These guys aren't women.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Actress Rose McGowan was doing a book tour. She's the one who has said that Harvey Weinstein raped her, and she was attacked by a heckler, a trans activist, who started yelling at her at the bookstore, just kind of, hijacking the event. So they would definitely want to quarantine the T part of that thing. But you don't really read. The average person does not read about that infighting. That's a conflict that's not well known to the public.
Yeah, it was. I saw that where the person heckled Rose. And, what's interesting about that is I told my wife, I said, isn't that cool? I said, this supposed transgender woman is acting much like a militant man. So, they behave like men. They're crazed. If anything can prove how wacko this group is, some of these people who rise up and do what this person did, they just prove themselves to be out of touch with reality.
At what point after you transitioned into the identity of Laura? I mean, you had legal name change, driver's license, wig,
No,
enhanced.
I had hair, baby. I didn't have no wig.
Yeah, that's all real?
That's all real, baby.
Then kudos to your stylist.
No wigs ever. Look, I still got beautiful hair. Give me a break.
Do. Kudos where they're deserved. At what point did things start to go south? That the dream of being Laura and this feminine identity, the reality began to separate from the fantasy of it. And you've told me this before, but I just want my listeners to hear how dark it got, and your drinking and thoughts of suicide and attempt and all that.
Well, I started getting sober. I started getting sober. I wanted to become a counselor, so I started studying at UC Santa Cruz. I was studying the psychology of addictions and a lot of different issues that people deal with when they drink. And so I was beginning to get sober, and I was studying at UC Santa Cruz in this certificate program to become a counselor. And so it was when I started opening the books up and reading in the books about psychology and addictions and issues, and I ran across these disorders I'd never heard of, like separation anxiety. And one of the first ones I read was a study that came out of Cornell back, I don't know, in the 50s or something, and said that there were men who were taking on the identity of women because they had lost their mother. Their mother died, and the way that they could feel close to them was actually to take on their mother's identity and become a female. I thought, whoa, that's crazy, And so I began to explore these different things, and then all of a sudden you start to find that there are numerous psychological disorders that foster the idea of wanting to become someone who you're not. Schizophrenia, dissociative disorders, bipolar disorders, alcoholism. There's just there's this big laundry list of items. So I kind of came to the conclusion that the idea of transgender was just a blanket word for a whole bunch of disorders that were resting underneath that. In other words, transgender was a behavior where underneath that behavior was mental disorders. And so then the key, I thought, as I studied this, was that once you identified what what they call comorbid disorder was, that was causing them to feel and behave the way they feel and treated it, they wouldn't be transgender anymore. And I found that actually to be true.
Mm-hmm. That cohered with your experience.
Exactly.
Suicidal ideation, in your case?
Yeah, absolutely. I attempted suicide. Yeah.
At what point, Walt, did you, as Laura, say, look, I got to get out of Dodge. This is the biggest mistake of my life. Were you in a kind of a pit of despair? You figured, look, there's no going back. You can't go back to terra firma. I can't go back to Walt. Were you thinking all those thoughts?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you go through that. Well, I was working because of my studies, I was working in a psychiatric hospital in Southern California as what they called a chemical dependency technician. And there was a great psychiatric doctor that was on the wing. Mm-hmm. And he and I got to be good friends. And he knew a little bit about my life. And we had talked some when we had some downtime. And we began to converse on a daily basis about it. And he then told me, he says, you probably should go and get a complete diagnostic workup because you may have what they call a dissociative disorder. And so I went for 3 months, maybe 4 months worth of therapy with a gal over on Wilshire Boulevard in the high rent district, which he helped me financially take care of. So what we found out was that I had a dissociative disorder. Well, what that means is you just, you're dissociating from who you are to become someone who you can't be. It didn't rise to the level of multiple personalities. There's these subtle dissociative disorders that are more complex or not quite as, you actually know what the other person is, where multiple you don't. So then I began to wonder, gee, am I the only one that falls into this category? Well, if you study and look at the things that they've now printed and published, is that about 30% of all transgenders suffer from dissociative disorders. Now, how many people talk about it? Nobody.
So all of this conversation with the doctor on Wilshire who sent you to the specialist, this is all post-op, right? This is he was addressing Laura.
Yeah.
Well, no one talks about that, the inverse side of it.
No.
It's supposed to be Shangri-La. It's, the Caitlyn Jenner Disneyland of happiness. Yeah,
well, Caitlyn Jenner's obviously got Caitlyn Jenner problems, and maybe if Caitlyn's fortunate enough, Caitlyn will find out what's really wrong with Caitlyn. But so once I discovered that, then I realized, you can't live out this lie because, number one, being a transgender is a bit of a fraud because you can't become a woman. You're not a woman. Biologically, you're not a woman. And being transgender just means that you're dealing with a complex bunch of psychological and emotional or social disorders that you've never resolved.
Yeah.
So if you resolve them, then you can put away this fake gender and become your real self. And so that's what I've done.
Are you as astounded as I am, Walt, at how a phenomena that affects about 1/3 of 1% of the population should so control the cultural narrative about what thoughts are permitted, what speech is permitted, about this phenomenon? If all you do is read Newsweek and watch CNN, you assume every 10th person's transgender. It's very, very rare.
Yeah, and I've kind of come to the point to where when people say they're transgender, I say, no, you're not. You're just a guy wanting to wear a dress, or you're a girl who wants to look like a guy. I don't even like using the terms. I think one of the problems is we've sort of taken on and used their terms. I've kind of moved away from using their terminology because it sort of lends credit to it. And if you go back and look at the founders of the term, which you have Kinsey, Benjamin, and Money, they're all pedophile activists. I mean, this whole thing started by 3 pedophiles. People, Kinsey was a person who was a masturbation addict who thought it was good to have adult men to have sex with young boys. So did Benjamin, so did Money. They were all very sick, mentally ill guys.
Who were the full name? John Money. I recognize that name. Who's the Benjamin?
Harry Benjamin was the guy who coined the term transgenderism, and everybody knows Kinsey, who a great wacko nut job he was. So we built this foundation of what you're seeing in our society on 3 very, very, and there were other sick men too, but I coined these the Three Musketeers, because they're really, I mean, it's sickening that there weren't enough adult men in the room at the time to stop these people from moving forward with this agenda. I mean, give credit where credit is due. Dr. Paul McHugh was the first one to step in and put his foot down, but he got creamed. He still gets creamed. He came out with a study, in the late 70s and showed it was all nonsense. What's really interesting that doesn't get talked about was at almost the same time as he came out, McHugh came out with his study, there was at Harry Benjamin's clinic, Dr. Charles L. Ihlenfeld, who was the endocrinologist, a homosexual, as a matter of fact, and an advocate for gender change surgeries, had been working with 500 transgender people over a 6-year period. At the same time, McHugh came out, and here's Ihlenfeld saying, I'm getting out of doing this. Hormones are very dangerous. They're causing too many people to commit suicide, and it's causing too much happiness, and it's not curing the psychological ills that are causing people to behave this way. Mm-hmm. So he went into psychiatry. Now, McHugh got slammed because, he's a faith-based person. Ihlenfeld, they just never published anything. So I've put Ihlenfeld's name out every time I can, because he said identically the same thing that McHugh did, except probably more explicitly.
And strictly based on the scientific research, and they can't write it off as religious dogma or some biblical prohibition.
Right. Yeah. So he was finding even more dire evidence, because he's talking directly about too many suicides and too much unhappiness, and it's not curing the psychological problems that these people have. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right today.
Sure. Has any effort been made to connect you with Caitlyn Jenner? At least reach out just to know that you exist? Because I wonder about that conversation.
That would be a nice conversation to have.
You told me a few years ago. In fact, I discovered you the week that the Caitlyn Jenner Vanity Fair hit the newsstands. It was kind of a providential coincidence there. And you said, watch what happens 5 to 7 years from now. Is that sort of the magic zone of regret, where some fog lifts and you begin to see things more clearly? Isn't there sort of a window? It's not going to be the next Tuesday. It's not going to be a year later. Am I misremembering here?
No, I think that's right. And I think, I would, and I'm totally speculating here, and I'll put it in that category, but Jenner likely is suffering from a term of what we call autogynephilia, which is, we have a group of people who identify as transgender. They're not transgender. They're people who like to see themselves dressed up as females, and they actually become the object of their own sexual affection. And
it's a sort of malignant narcissism, isn't it? An eroticized narcissism.
Yeah, the movie The Danish Girl probably paints the best picture of autogynephilia that I've seen, although they tried to say it was transgenderism. I think it's interesting how the LGBT puts everything into the category of transgenderism, but they don't talk about drag queens, cross-dressers, transvestites,
right,
and autogynephilia. There's a whole bunch of other people who are not even close to identifying fully as a woman, but they get thrown into the hopper, and they get the hormone treatment, and they get the surgical treatment, and then they contact me like I get all the time, saying, can you help me detransition? One of the biggest movements in the whole community today is people wanting help to detransition, because they found out somewhere between 7, 8, 10, sometimes I've had them up to 20 years, between 5 and 20 years, they say, I've been regretting this, but it takes a lot of courage to detransition. So sometimes when they contact me, it's 2 years later before they actually get up the courage to detransition.
Sexchangeregret.com. That's the place to go, right? I want to get the website out there in case there's people listening who are in that situation, or who know and love someone who is.
Right.
So you've gone through 2 radical surgeries. You went through the Walt Heyer, and then you went back. What was the triggering incident in your life, Walt, where you realized I can't take this darkness anymore? I'm thinking of George Bailey,
Yeah.
I want to live. I want to live. I want to go back to my original identity. That must have taken a lot of courage.
Well, you get sober, and
Mm-hmm.
then you get sober, then you get the truth. You realize that you've just been duped into thinking that people can change genders. You realize you've been lied to, and the world is in one place, and then you start looking for a biblical support. And I turned to Christ, and then in my book, A Transgender's Faith, it tells a story about how Christ came and spoke with me. We had a conversation, and so he redeemed and restored my life. And so I've unwrapped the gift of redemption and restoration as often as I can to as many people as I can, so that they don't have to live in this nonsense of thinking that they've changed genders. It's delusional at best. It's very harmful at worst. And, if it's so good and so wonderful to change genders, people need to continue to ask the question, why then do 40 to 50% of the people who identify as transgenders attempt suicide? The reason is they're unhappy. It doesn't work. And if you look at suicide.org, it says people attempt suicide because they have unaddressed, untreated psychological disorders. Most of the time, it's depression. So we're not treating their depression.
Are you familiar with the study in Sweden about I want to say, your chances for a suicidal attempt go up by 20 times greater than the general population? Because the activists want to tell you, well, this is because of societal pressure and shaming and homophobia and so on. Yeah. But Sweden has been doing this for 30 years or more. Very so-called enlightened, progressive, uber-tolerant society. It can't be that. But why the reluctance to say that maybe this is something internal, something to do with the thing itself, and not from external,
their
peer
whole
pressure?
Thing would collapse. If it's exposed for what it is, transgenders don't exist. I mean, the term transgender is just a word. It's an idea. You have the idea that you're a transgender. There isn't any medical proof a transgender even exists. There isn't anybody that can run a test and put it up on the screen like you do for a broken leg and say, oh, there's a transgender there. Yeah. There's nothing there. They can't prove it. It's an idea.
Well, it's an idea that's acted like a virus that's implanted itself in the kind of social consciousness. I'm sure there's some people right now are shocked that you're even saying this, that we're even talking about it in these terms.
Yeah, I would
because
call
of the propaganda.
I would call it a cancer because anytime it's killing so many people via suicide, that's bad. I mean, I would say that if the people who are undergoing these changes have an equal attempted suicide rate and death rate to that of the regular population, you're going to hear me get silent. But as long as the people have early mortality rates, they have all kinds of other issues, medical issues, they get cancers quicker because of the hormone therapies, they ingest the hormones to try to speed up the process. There's just everything wrong with this, and people have bought into it. And we need to stop listening to the LGBT and taking cues from the LGBT, because they're actually the ones that have caused the deaths to occur. They are really the founders of this absolute nonsense. And somebody really needs to step up and stand above the crowd and say, we need to stop this. We need to stop it now. Too many people are dying, and now, as Michelle Curtella is pointing out, that it's happening to kids. This is horrible.
What factors do you see, Walt, in causing this current enthusiasm for transgenderism? Because this is not something that you would read about in the 1920s. It seems like a kind of a postmodern, post-sexual failed revolution phenomena. Now it's everywhere. Go ahead.
Okay, you get political people who want to paint themselves as being, highly informed. They're more sensitive. They're more caring. They're better than those people who, like me, I'm not a caring person. I'm not a nice person because I'm telling the truth. The fact of the matter is that this is political. People are getting elected to positions of power because they're embracing transgenders, the LGBT, because the LGBT will fund them. We just saw that in one of the states in the U.S. where somebody funneled tons of money into this transgender person. If the person wasn't a transgender, they never would have got elected. So we need to understand that we're setting people up for disaster. and we're putting these people in places of authority they should not be. They really need good, sound psychological help. We need to stop calling them transgenders. They're not. They're men in dresses, or they're women trying to look like men. They're either transvestites or they're autogynephilia. There's something that's not being properly addressed. Sorry for telling the truth, but someday we got to step up and actually do this, and maybe we can reduce the number of people who are attempting suicides.
Brendan Manning, now known as Chelsea Manning, is running for Senate.
There you go.
That's Exhibit A, isn't it?
Yeah, he'll get tons of money.
Yeah,
And
although guilty of espionage. This is an espionage agent, right?
There is a bright light that you really want to have in your political system. Somebody who believes in espionage and subverting the government and doing all the things that this individual has done. There's no good quality in that individual. Sorry.
We've got a few minutes left, Walt. I want to go back to your encounter with our Lord Jesus Christ. In the Catholic tradition, we have the habit, if you will, the small t tradition of the crucifix and not the bare cross. And people often ask me, so why do you worship a dead Christ? And I always like to say that we were not saved by the cross. We were saved by Jesus on the cross. The cross happened to be the historical, in a way, accidental mode of torture and death. If Jesus had died in Alabama in the early 40s, maybe we'd be having, the electric chair on a bro. I don't know. But the suffering servant is our Savior. He understands all our woes. He's taken on all our sufferings. When you had that encounter with Christ, was it as Christ who understood your hurting? It wasn't obviously an academic Savior. It was more of a personal, experiential. I just want to revisit that for people who are reaching out in prayer and despair, really.
Well, it's funny you mentioned prayer. I was in prayer. I was deep in prayer with a PhD psychologist, and we had gone over all of the things that had troubled me for much of my life, and we had spent many hours together that day, and we were deep in prayer, and it seemed like the longest prayer. I knew this guy prayed for a long time, and I didn't really want to pray that long. I wanted to get out of his office. I was kind of worn out. And so during this prayer, all of a sudden, I could actually see the Lord coming toward me, and he had his arms reaching out toward me. And I'm like, whoa. And all of a sudden, I looked down, and he was reaching toward this little baby that was wrapped in cloth. And I looked at the little baby and realized it was me. And the Lord picked that baby up and pulled him into his chest and spoke to the baby, which was me, and said, "You will be safe with me forever." And I remember that moment. I started to weep. The Lord held him, turned, and disappeared in the dream. And then the prayer was over, and I came out of the prayer realizing I've just been redeemed and restored by Jesus Christ. He came to me. And I realized at that moment then that I needed to serve him and tell the truth as I am today, each and every day of my life, and serve him in that way.
And you have had people come back channel to you, right? Like Nicodemus, sort of not wanting to talk about the fact that they regret their sex changes. And can you share an anecdote, Walt, of someone who was similarly liberated and helped back to his true identity?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it happens quite frequently. And once they realize that they don't have to be trapped in this phony identity, this idea that came to them, a way of escaping some pain that they had because they have some other problem. And when they realize that they're free in Christ, when they can be free in Christ, they can be free to leave all that behind. That's where redemption and restoration starts. And they shed those clothing and take on the identity the way that Christ made them to be, and they can go live a free life and enjoy the life that God made them.
How often are you speaking? You travel and conferences and...
Yeah, I'll be in Spain this month, and I'll be in a couple of different states in next month. I speak almost every month.
Have you ever debated, Walt?
No.
Interested in it?
Not sure that I'm a good debater. I've never thought about it.
Because sometimes debates can... I know that my friend Dr. William Lane Craig, who debates atheists, around the world. He's one of the people Richard Dawkins doesn't want to get in the ring with. And he doesn't do the debates to convert atheists. He doesn't think the track record's very successful because they'll walk into a debate with their heels dug in for their guy, right? They're not really there to assess and sift through information. He does it because of that mushy middle who show up kind of out of curiosity. He wants to touch them, wants to reach them with the message. Because I think you'd be a fine debater. In a way, isn't it true? You're not really trying to win the debate so much as win the soul. You want to win that person.
Yeah. I don't know. It's nothing I've ever thought about.
Okay.
I do have. When I do speak, sometimes I get surrounded by LGBT activists screaming in my face, and I suppose at times I'm debating with myself and 6 other people at the same time, but it's really not a fair debate.
What's in your creative pipeline? You're working on a new book?
I've had one book in process for a long time. I've got another book in process, but I've been so busy that I haven't been able to stop long enough and go to the mountain and get some silence and get them done.
If you had a message for someone who stumbled upon this show right now, who did a Google search and they've never heard this before and they want to know what they can do, they've gone through the surgery, they're in the pit of despair, they wish they hadn't done it, what would you say to that person?
Well, I'd say you can get out of it. Understand that you really never changed genders. You just took on a cosmetic appearance of a different gender. So once you realize that you didn't change gender and you just sort of played out a role for whatever reason, you need to look at real deeply at what caused you to not want to be who you are and why you started down this journey to become someone who that you can never really become in reality. So, the people are hurting. I think it's so important. They're hurting, and people really need to hear the truth when they're hurting. And that's what I really object to the most about the whole transgender, quote, movement, is because they're not telling them, well, let's sit down and talk about what's causing you to not want to be who you are. And that's what I end up doing every time someone contacts me. And I can tell you this today. Every time that I get in these conversations with people who regret it, 100% of the time, they can tell me what caused them to take on the identity of a different gender. And it's usually something to do with a molestation, some kind of abuses, some kind of deep loss. Maybe they've been traded around to different foster care in 5 or 6 homes, and they had things that happened in those different homes that were unpleasant. These people are loaded with pain, and you can understand why they did not want to be who they are and why they're trying to become someone else. Now, there are people today who are taking on these different identities because it's kind of socially hip to be a transgender. I mean, man, that's like if you're struggling to get attention, become a transgender, you'll get all you want.
Yeah, they're the new kind of avant-garde, Insta celebrity.
Exactly. So the very narcissistic, and so if you're a narcissistic and you're not getting attention, you can sure do it. Become a transgender, and you can make the cover of a magazine.
There is a taboo against talking the truth to people who are hurting, isn't there? It's like, well, why would I do that? It's just going to add an avalanche of pain, when in fact it's the antidote to the pain. Yeah,
well, the people don't see it. I've sat down with these individuals. I've been fighting a cold.
Mm-hmm. A lot of that going around.
When you speak the truth, they absolutely love it. And I've met them in hotels and coffee shops, and I met one individual at the end of last year who, in trying to restore his life, or actually first started down his transgender journey, ended up with 167 gender surgeries.
167.
Yeah, I wrote an article about it in the Daily Signal. And so, you see the madness. That is the top of the scale. He's written up in the Guinness Book of World Records for an individual with the most sex change surgeries or gender affirming surgeries of any person on earth, 167. And the doctors are so, caught up in collecting the money from these poor saps. They don't care if they're suffering psychologically. They just want to fill their coffers and do another surgery. 167 surgeries. The doctors should be locked up and put in jail.
That's amazing. I wonder if there's something similar, something analogous between the transgender movement and this epidemic of people wanting radical facial reconstruction. This is no longer just a Hollywood elite thing. Average people are wanting to change their appearance because of some deep unhappiness when they look in the mirror. I wonder if there's something analogous there.
Oh yeah, I think all these people could benefit a great deal from good psychotherapy. The problem is there's not much of it out there. From the point of view of the framework in which we're talking about. We're talking about, yeah. It's hard to get good, sound psychotherapy, a good psychotherapist that'll start looking at what I call the comorbid disorders, the real key things that are causing people to behave the way they behave. And it's so interesting to me because I'm not a psychotherapist. I can sit down and ask the people in one email 5, 6, or 7 questions, and all of a sudden they just spill it out. I've learned this over the last 12 years. There's just some kind of key things that you can ask, and they just open up and just spill it out to you. But I'm safe. They know I'm safe. Yeah,
and they trust you.
Yeah.
You're like a chiropractor of the soul. One little adjustment, the elbow goes into that knotted tissue, and boom, they're
it helps me
freed
too,
up to speak the truth.
They do a lot for me too. So.
Walt, what's the best way to connect with you? Which of your websites would you like folks to go to find out more?
sexchangeregret.com or waltheyer.com.
That's HEYER.com, right?
Right.
And you'll get on an airplane and go pretty much anywhere to talk to. Do you speak with priests and pastors and ministers and rabbis, that kind of thing? Do you do any
bishops.
Kind of bishops, right? Praise God.
Yeah, I was in Hong Kong and got private meeting with the bishop and his crew over there, and I spoke 8 times in Hong Kong in October. I've been to Italy and spoke at the Catholic retreat there. Over 200 people with psychologists and doctors and teachers. So we do this around the world, whether it's Australia, whether it's Hong Kong, Canada. I was in Calgary last year. So that's what we do.
Well, you get an army of Catholic support, and so be assured of our prayers, Walt. Delighted to talk to you again, and Godspeed, as they say in Latin, ad multos años, many more years.
Thank you.
All right, waltheyer.com, that's WaltHeyer, or sexchangeregret.com. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?